So this is going to be a quick overview of how I process and digest what I read during and in post. And this is coming from the background of someone who hasn't studied English literature beyond what they did at school. The tools that I use are a mechanical pencil and an A6 notebook. I prefer a pencil to a pen just because there's no risk of bleeding. It's a lot less likely to run through the pages. I choose a 0.5mm lead thickness as it's easy to just write in the margins, although I rarely do, but just to underline, to highlight sections, and do so without going over any of the wording, even in books which are very fine print and narrow line spacing. Then I accompany that with an A6 notebook, which I use just to jot down any ideas that I have while reading. So rather than writing my thoughts in the margin, I prefer to do it in a separate book. As I'm writing down ideas, I will try to, although I've only started doing this recently, put the page number that I'm at when I'm having that thought, so that I can try to connect thoughts to highlighting or to just page numbers, so that I don't read a thought months down the line and then wonder, where am I going with this and what's the relevance of it. Turning to the actual book and using The Idiot by Dostoevsky as an example, I actually have very minimal markings when it comes to the page. So that is the extent of the markings. I put sort of markings in the margin of the section, the start and end point of the quote, and then I will just put a line along the margin so that I know, if I'm flicking through the book, it's very easy to see as just a reference point that this is the section. What I will do then is at the front of the book, create the contents page, which is based thematically. So I have the written themes and the assigned page numbers. And I will do that in its entirety at the first pass. And then the second pass is where the underlining takes place. So I'm going through and I'm looking at which ones I think were actually worth remembering, and which of the sections of the book that I picked out are still sticking with me maybe a week later, a couple of weeks later. So I don't really review it the day after or immediately when I finish reading, but it's something that I want to do a lot later on. And so I can come back with a fresh pair of eyes and think, does this quote make sense in isolation? And then when it comes to looking back at the book, it's really a good barometer to see what was an important theme. So for the prince, we see the innocence, honesty, how people react to the prince are particularly prevalent within the book. And besides themes, another thing that I'll do is pick out really excellent pieces of writing, or pieces of writing that I found very, not moving, but I found them exceptional. I think this is also why I believe that it's particularly important to memorize passages and poetry, as then you have these very well constructed and beautifully written pieces of art, really. They can start to influence how you put your words together, how you think, and ultimately how you speak. And so I think it's a very valuable process to highlight particularly good pieces of writing, especially if you want to improve your eloquence, improve the way that you talk, improve the way that you write. It's a very minimal part of the annotation process, but it's one that I think is important. Another recent addition is assigning emotion to lines that I'm picking out, and also using emotive responses by me to lead my selection of sections of the book. And it's not a huge emotional range. It's really things that made me laugh, things that gave me goosebumps, or things that made my eyes well up with tears. Not cry, as I haven't unlocked that ability yet, but just things which brought an emotional response. And they aren't really necessarily attached to an emotion, as goosebumps can be for a plethora of emotions, as can eyes welling up. But those are just sort of the three feelings or sensations, probably is the better way of putting it, that I want to focus upon. And I thought it might be useful to help expand an emotional range and to let that inform the absorption of a book. And I suppose that then leads to the most important question, which is, how do I select what I highlight? I don't really care about setting or the description of characters. I'm more interested in the actions and the words of the characters, as these really betray the intent of the author and also the thoughts of the author, regardless of the intent, as often those aren't so linked. And generally these take the forms of two things: ideas that I agree with and ideas that I disagree with. And perhaps the disagree with ones are the more interesting ones and the more thought-provoking aspects. Because when you agree with something, it's fairly banal. You agree with it and you know why you agree with it, hopefully. And that's it, really. You just read it, yeah, that makes sense, and you bank it. Whereas the things you disagree with, the challenge is to work out why. And are you justified in your disagreement? And if you are justified, then the author must be wrong. And when you tend to read the classics, that's a very difficult preposition to go through. Because is Tolstoy wrong? Dostoevsky? Is that what I'm saying in that matter? And they can be wrong. There's no reason why they can't be. But it's whether I believe that I'm in the position to say that they're wrong and to be able to judge them and to be able to outthink them. But I think we should also, or I try to also, think about, why do I agree with something? And why is what the author said relevant? Why does it mean something? Am I right to agree with it, and can I justify my position? And the second aspect that I'm looking for is the relevance of it. The relevance of it to my life, one, but also modern society. And how can I bring this classical interpretation into modern society and make it relevant there? The same thing that could be done for philosophy, or to be honest, any book. They all have lessons that can be updated to the modern times, or are instantly transferable. I don't really care too much for the historical context. And perhaps that's because I didn't study English literature, and so that wasn't drummed into me. But I just don't care. I'm not too bothered about the author's intent. And really, I don't want to know what the author's intent was. And I don't want to know what critics thought of the book. I don't want to be swayed even for a moment by someone else's impression of the book. I want to develop my own opinion based on nothing at all beyond what I think. And that's a strange position to be in, considering what I'm doing on this channel, which is talking about books, giving my opinion on them and my thoughts about them. Because in a sense, that's just completely hypocritical. And maybe it is. But I also appreciate that this is my approach to reading and how I like to do things. Not the only way, it's not the right way, it's just my way. But that tangent aside, I really am looking for things that I can apply to my own life. Things that I think, yes, that is a good way to think about the world. That's a bad way to think about the world. This does describe modern society, which is ironic considering it was written 200 years ago. And just these nuggets of information which can help me understand myself, other people, and society at large. I think that they are very useful. So perhaps I'm almost reading them as a psychological or philosophical book, because I find that certain authors do a much better job than so-called philosophers or psychologists at explaining how the world and how people work. And then the third aspect, beyond the ideas that I agree or disagree with, beyond the sections of the book that I think are relevant to today's society and to my own life, I will also take just miscellaneous points. So in the Count of Monte Cristo, there was, I think, a sentence about the Crusades. I'm interested in the Crusades. I picked it up. I thought it might be worth having further down the line. It probably won't. I think 99% of the annotations that I make are completely useless going into the future, but that's not really the point. It's more to make not as many as possible, but not to be restricted when I'm making annotations. Not to think, oh, I'm making too many, or I'm not making enough, but just to let it happen very naturally and let my brain lead me and let my own sort of thoughts and interests lead me. If I pick up nothing, I pick up nothing. There was nothing in the book that was interesting. It doesn't mean the book's not interesting, but for me at that time, it wasn't. So really, when I'm highlighting, I'm not doing it when I'm constantly switched on and thinking, I need to find something about this. I need to find something about the theme of love. I need to find it, I need to pick it out. And perhaps this comes back to me not having studied English literature at a university level. So I'm not worried about having to write an essay on a certain character or how a theme is presented by the author. I'm just reading. I'm sort of free of those fetters. And I think that also comes back to the historical context, as I'm not thinking about how this work fits in within a broader context. Although I do tend to think about how an author's work fits in with the rest of their canon, how, for example, all the 19th century Russian authors fit together, comparing them to the 19th century French authors. I do like the Napoleonic era, so I have a sort of historical understanding of that time period and why that has led to the literature that has been spawned from it. But that has come to me very naturally. I'm not reading with any pressure to pick certain things out. I'm just really letting the pages and the words wash over me, and whatever sticks, sticks, and I take that. And that's fine. I've got no deadline to meet. I've got no goal with the reading. It's just to read the book, and whatever happens along the way happens. That's it. And I think really that's the approach that we should take to reading, but everything. There's no need to force anything. That rarely works. Forcing, being desperate for something to happen, never a good look. and it never works out. So that is my first pass of a book. And when it comes to the second time, all I'm doing is which quote, which section of the book best represents this theme. I'm really just removing duplicates and removing anything that no longer seems relevant to me, or that I might have done at the time. Obviously, this is much harder when it comes to the emotional aspect. It's quite difficult to rekindle that same sentiment at the second pass. You don't have the wider context which really led to that emotional crescendo. So largely I just ignore it, just push it over to the side, pretend the emotions aren't there, and that works. So that is how I sort of treat that, although I do place more emphasis on that, as I think any piece of writing which draws out an effective response it's important. And clearly there was something there, subconsciously. And that is why really I've started to pay particular importance to the emotional sections, as there's clearly something going on there that I'm not working out. So I'm hoping to sort of collate them and to work out, what are these things which are giving me such a visceral reaction? What are the things which are giving me goosebumps, which are making my eyes well up with tears? Why am I having these responses? And I don't know, maybe that seems quite a cold approach to emotions, to try and sort of collate them and see if I can generate it, but that's just, I don't know, that's the way that I thought about it, and that's the reason why I'm doing it, not for any more sort of, I don't know, romantic reason. That is how I read, or how I try to read more actively. I think it also helps if you are reading actively with a pen in hand, is it can heighten your focus and mean that you're better digesting what you are reading. My system isn't perfect, not even for me. It's something I'm constantly trying to iterate upon and trying to build upon. It's also worth noting that so I read Othello just before I read The Count of Monte Cristo, and reading two books which are very similar themes, and then going on to another book, I believe it was a Pushkin book, it's very difficult not to want to bring those ideas with you, and not to want to try and see jealousy and revenge in whatever you're reading. So it's something that I really try and be conscious of, that I'm not forcing ideas upon the book, but I'm allowing the book to speak to me, for want of a better way of putting that. So I think that's something which is important, and that we should never try and impose ourselves upon a piece of literature, but we should allow it to mix with us. We're doing a dance with the book. We're bringing our own experiences, our own understandings to it, but we're allowing it to lead us. And I think that's probably the most important mindset to have when reading a book. You don't want to just have that confirmation bias and find everything that you're looking for by some magical surprise. If you do find it, great, but let the book bring that to you. Don't go looking and forcing it. Again, it just doesn't work. Never good to force it. And with that, see you in the next one.